Hello, I'm doing a movie review, and the movie I want to review is the 1941 horror classic, The Wolfman. Now, The Wolfman was produced and distributed by Universal Pictures, and this very much fits in with many of Universal's other horror films like Frankenstein and Dracula, but unlike those movies, which are both based on books, The Wolfman is a completely original film. Now, of course, legends of werewolves have existed throughout human history, and this wasn't the first werewolf movie, but this is easily the most influential werewolf film. Like, pretty much every other werewolf movie that's come after this owes something to this movie. Like, this movie basically did for the werewolf genre what Night of the Living Dead would later do for the zombie genre. Now, I actually did do a review of this movie a number of years ago, but I took my old review down because, honestly, I was just not impressed with my old review, so I felt like re-reviewing it. But The Wolfman is a classic film, and there's a reason this movie is still talked about and still remembered today. And in my opinion, next to The Bride of Frankenstein, I think this is the second best of all the Universal horror films. Because it's not just a horror film, this is also a drama film as well. And it's a very sad film, and the movie really does feel like a tragedy. Now, the plot of The Wolfman is it's about this man named Lawrence Talbot who returns to his hometown shortly after his brother was killed in a hunting accident, and right off the bat you could tell that the relationship between him and his father is somewhat strained because his father even brings up it takes a tragedy to bring you back home. But in the movie, Lawrence ends up falling head over heels for this girl named Gwen, and he asks her out on a date, and him and her and a friend of hers go to see these gypsies so they could get their fortunes told, and this one gypsy named Bela, who turns out to be a werewolf, he ends up suffering a spell as this werewolf, and he ends up killing this girl, and Lawrence tries to save the girl and kills Bela, but gets bitten beforehand. Now, of course, Talbot doesn't believe in werewolves or anything like that. He thought this was a regular wolf that was attacking this girl, and he tells people that he killed a wolf, but all they find is the dead body of Bela. So now it's really eating at Lawrence Talbot psychologically because he thinks he might have murdered a man. But long story short, because he was attacked by this werewolf and lived, he now has the werewolf curse on him. And eventually he does turn into the titular Wolfman and starts going on a little killing spree, and of course when he turns back into a human, this is really eating at him now because he's killing people but he can't help it. But that's the basic plotline of the Wolfman. I am skipping over a lot of other stuff, but I just wanted to give a basic outline of the plot. Now, in the film, Lon Chaney Jr. plays Lawrence Talbot and the Wolfman, and he gives such a heartbreaking performance in this film because Lawrence Talbot is a genuinely likable character. Like, in the beginning of the film, he's so charming and so likable, even though his way of asking Gwen out is actually a little creepy by today's standards. If you've seen the movie, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about, but even then, he's still very charming. Like, he really does seem like just a good person, and he's somebody who doesn't deserve what's happening to him at all. And you really do feel his mental anguish and his desperation when all this is happening to him. Now, Lon Chaney Jr. was of course the son of silent film actor Lon Chaney. Now, Lon Chaney Sr. died way before this movie came out, but I have a feeling had he lived to see his son in this movie, he definitely would have been proud, because his son gives a hell of a performance in this movie. And you really do see how what's happening to Lawrence Talbot is eating at him psychologically. Like, there's this really, honestly, kind of moving scene where Lawrence Talbot goes to Bela's funeral, and he's sort of hiding out in the crypt while Mileva, who is Bela's mother, is laying him to rest, and you see him crying because he feels so guilty over what happened to Bela. Once again, it's such a good performance that I honestly think still holds up today. In the movie, Claude Rains plays John Talbot, Lawrence Talbot's father, and he also gives a great performance, and it's that love that he has for his son which makes the ending of this film really heartbreaking. Evelyn Ankers plays the character of Gwen, and Lon Chaney Jr. and Evelyn Ankers honestly had great chemistry with each other in this movie. Like, you really do buy their relationship, even though it's not really a relationship, because in the movie you find out that Gwen's actually already engaged, but in the film you could really tell that she's starting to fall in love with Lawrence. And it sort of makes it like a tragic love story because you realize that she actually loves Lawrence Talbot way more than she loves her own fiancé. And it's kind of funny that Chaney and Ankers had such great chemistry in this movie because apparently they did not get along too well in real life. In the movie, Patric Knowles plays Gwen's fiancé. Maria Ouspenskaya, I have no idea if I'm saying her last name right, but she plays the character of Mileva, who is this old gypsy woman who really has become a very iconic character. And she's the mother of the character of Bela, who is the werewolf who infects Talbot with the werewolf curse. But she gives a great performance in this movie, and a lot of her lines of dialogue, if it was anybody else, would sound really pretentious, but she really does sell it. Like, some of the things she says in this movie are almost poetic in a way. Like, I forgot exactly what she said in the scene where she was laying Bela to rest, but what she says really does sound, once again, poetic. And then Bela Lugosi actually played the character of Bela. And another thing I really love about this is, of all the old Universal horror films, this one really does feel the most mature and the most adult. And there's so much psychological complexity to this story and to the Lawrence Talbot character. And I do like how it incorporates aspects of psychology into it, even though it's pretty obvious that what's happening in the movie is supernatural. There's at least this discussion about things like schizophrenia and split personality disorder. And another thing I really love about this movie is something I noticed with a lot of the other Universal horror films is a lot of them seem to feel the need to incorporate some humor into the story, but this is actually a pretty dead serious movie. And because of that, for me, it really does feel like the most mature out of all the Universal horror films. And it would be a crime and a sin not to at least mention Jack Pierce's makeup effects in this movie. And I have to say that the makeup effects in this film for the Wolfman are still pretty impressive even by today's standards. Sure, the transformation sequence is certainly not as impressive as you would see in later werewolf films like An American Werewolf in London or The Howlin', but the actual makeup effects itself for the Wolfman, I still think is pretty damn good. Now, this movie did spawn a series of sequels, however, all the sequels were actually crossovers with other franchises. The first sequel to this movie was 1943's Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, which was obviously also part of Universal's Frankenstein series. The third Wolfman movie was House of Frankenstein, which was a crossover between the Wolfman series, the Frankenstein series, and Universal's Dracula series. That was followed up by The House of Dracula, which once again was a crossover between all three of those franchises. And then the final film of the original Wolfman series was the 1948 horror comedy film Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, which acted as both a sequel and a parody of the Universal monster films. Now, even though this was the only standalone Wolfman movie of the original series, if you actually look at Lawrence Talbot's arc throughout those movies, he really does have a very interesting character arc throughout all those films, even Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. Now, since October's coming up, which is when I do Horror Month, one of the horror franchises that I'm planning on reviewing for Horror Month is Universal's Frankenstein series, which I actually did do reviews of those movies before, but I took my old reviews down, and these new reviews that I did with two friends of mine, and since all the Wolfman sequels were actually crossovers with that series, you're gonna see me and my friends talking about the sequels to this movie when we're reviewing the Frankenstein series. But for this movie, the original Wolfman, I'm just reviewing it as a standalone film. Now, in the 1960s, British film studio Hammer did a film called The Curse of the Werewolf with Oliver Reed. Now, that movie was actually based on a book, but you could tell that Hammer was basically doing that movie to be sort of their version of the Wolfman, even if it wasn't a straight remake. Now, the Wolfman and the character of Lawrence Talbot have appeared in so many other things that are based on the Wolfman, like the 1987 Fred Dekker film, The Monster Squad. The Wolfman is one of the main villains of that film. There was also an Alvin and the Chipmunks movie called Alvin and the Chipmunks Meet the Wolfman, which was sort of a sequel to one they did where they met the Frankenstein monster. And I used to watch that one all the time when I was a little kid, and what was cool about that was the werewolf actually was called Lawrence Talbot, even though he shared no characteristics with Lon Chaney Jr.'s character in this movie. And there was a remake of this movie in 2010. Now, I know a lot of people don't like the 2010 remake. I thought it was okay. Granted, I haven't seen it since it came out, but I thought it was an alright film. Now, a character based on Lawrence Talbot, I believe was a reoccurring character on that show Penny Dreadful. And author Neil Gaiman actually made the character of Lawrence Talbot a reoccurring character in several of his stories. Now, I haven't read this book, but there was a recent novel called A Werewolf Remembers, and from what I've heard of that book, it's basically written as if it's the diary of Lawrence Talbot, and it actually takes all of the old Universal Wolfman movies into continuity, even Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. And as I mentioned before, this movie had a huge influence on virtually every other werewolf movie that's come after it. You could even see its influence in something like An American Werewolf in London. In fact, the main character, David, outright references this movie in that movie. Now, before I end this video, I want to cut to two short reviews on this movie done by two friends of mine. The first short review was done by my friend Chris, and the other short review was done by my friend Christian Feliciano.
So what stands out about Wolfman amongst all the original Universal monster movies is that you get to Dracula, you have sort of a dark lord, a dark count, if you will, this vampire who's kind of collecting people almost, and kind of making them do their bidding. You go to Frankenstein, and our monster is a mad scientist to some degree, or, I guess depending on how you look at it, the creation itself. But then you get to Wolfman, and the interesting thing is, the monster, without debate, is our protagonist, is our hero. And that, I think, is so cool and so different. Maybe I'm biased towards it because I've always had a thing for wolves, and I've always loved the werewolf stories, but this is my personal favorite of the Universal monster movies. Love Lon Chaney Jr., obviously. Everything in it is very iconic without trying to. I think it's just because for the time that it came out at and what kind of story it was telling. But, I think it's really significant and really cool, and the thing that really grounds it and really makes it enjoyable and makes you invested is the relationship between Lawrence and Gwen. You know, when he walks into the shop at the beginning, you know, they're really cute, and they have like an instant chemistry that you feel, and it really gets you involved. And that's interesting because, you know, the unspoken truth about all those original Universal monster movies, the subtext was always love. In The Mummy, you know, it's all about bringing Anoxidamon back. You know, he's doing it for love. Dracula, you know, everybody's caught up between Mina. You know, Drake wants Mina, they want to get her back. You know, obviously Jonathan wants to marry her, that kind of thing. And then, you know, Frankenstein had Elizabeth with the whole subplot with her. So love was really the common theme throughout these films, as much as they were these kind of like spooky gothic horror flicks. Like, that really was what they were all about at the end of it. And this one, that love story, is what grounds the whole thing. And it's something that I feel not a lot of people talk about and not a lot of people notice. And it's really cool and really unique that these, you know, these very spooky black and white horror films, really they were kind of like love stories with monsters in it. So having said that, yeah, I really enjoy this one a lot. I love the idea of, you know, the monster within us all. I love the idea of the hero being the villain at the same time, not by his own choice or by his own feeling, just simply circumstance is what puts him into this situation. And we can't really hate him for what he does, any of the violence that he causes, or any of the kind of fear that he incites, because it's nothing that he wants. It's totally forced on him. And that's the true horror of the story, is that we like Lawrence. We don't hate him at all, but unfortunately he's just afflicted with this really terrible condition that turns him into a monster against his will. And I think the best horror stories, what they do is they take what real horror is in the real world, and they extrapolate it to the realm of fantasy. So if you want to take something like, you know, meeting a girl, falling in love, and then this terrible thing happens that puts a wedge between the two of you, this is putting that to the nth degree, to the point where you literally turn into a monster when the moon is full. So I can't really think of anything more horrifying than that, you know? It's really significant and really cool, and it's cool to see this kind of storytelling in an old movie, where I feel like the perception of a lot of these old flicks is that they were phoned in and there was no real thought put into them. And, you know, out of all of them, I'm pretty sure this is one of the few that wasn't based on a pre-existing idea or like novel or anything like that. This was very much its own thing. As much as werewolves were obviously like a thing beforehand, this kind of just took the idea of the werewolf and ran with it, and they very much like told their own story. So yeah, definitely my personal favorite of the Universal monster movies. And you know, I gotta be honest, and this is something that a lot of people are gonna get pissed at me about saying, but I actually like the remake with Benicio. It was only violent when it needed to be violent. There were some really cool themes. Gwen was made an even bigger part of the story in it. They added in the whole father-son subplot. It was interesting for me personally, and I thought it was a cool way to expand it. I don't think it's necessarily as good as the original, but I do think that it does stand well as almost like a companion piece. I feel like a lot of people hated it for the CGI. Fair enough. But, you know, I mean, personally, I enjoyed it. And I think that maybe if this Dark Universe stuff that's coming out now ever gets back on its legs, they could probably do a pretty decent Wolfman movie if they just, you know, pay attention, tell a good story, write a good script. So we'll see what happens with that. But the Wolfman itself, damn good horror movie. And if you haven't seen it, definitely check it out.
Usually when I do a movie review, I like to be funny and not take things too seriously. But in order to prepare for this movie, I rewatched The Wolfman. And I'm just astounded that after all these years and after all the times that I've watched it, this movie still holds up, and it proves that nothing, not even time, will change the fact that this movie is one of the greatest ever. The film stars Lon Chaney Jr., and as expected, he is amazing as Larry Talbot, aka the Wolfman. But what you probably didn't expect is that he makes the monster in this film extremely sympathetic. Now, the reason why I say that you probably wouldn't expect that is because if you listen to a lot of snobby film critics and loads of horror fans these days, you would think that the creation of the sympathetic monster started with Anne Rice in the Vampire Chronicles. But in reality, that whole concept began with the old Universal horror films. I won't go into Frankenstein or Dracula or any of the other creatures from this era, because, then it would just drag this review on a little longer than it should be. But they were the first to make the idea of being a monster a tragedy. Before this, monsters were just monsters. They were evil, psychotic, with no sense of morality whatsoever. But the Universal films didn't seem to think that that idea was realistic, so they made their creatures tragic figures, similar to those you would find in a Shakespearean play, for example. And Lon Chaney Jr. does an amazing job of making you feel terrible for this creature. You didn't hate the Wolfman, you pitied him. Yes, we can thank the beautiful writing and directing for this as well, and I do. But I think that this film would not work at all had they chosen someone else to play the Wolfman. I won't spoil anything, but Chaney gives such a fantastic performance that when the ending finally comes, you feel truly heartbroken. To be fair though, it isn't just Lon Chaney Jr. as I mentioned before. The writing is fantastic, the directing is amazing. Set designs are something to be envy of, especially today when everything is so full of CG that you're wondering if you're really watching a film or someone play a video game. I mean, the atmosphere that it builds is timeless. I mean, it just feels timeless. You don't actually know what time period this is set in, and at some points, you wonder if maybe it's set before the movie is supposed to be filmed, before that time period, or if it's supposed to be actually based in the time period that it was filmed in, or maybe a little bit after. You're not really sure, but it doesn't matter because whether you're watching it back then or you're watching it now, it just feels timeless. And you remember that new Wolfman movie, the remake that came out? I know it's very taboo to mention it. Well, in the old one, the transformation is actually a lot better. Yes, it's just a frame fading into another frame until he becomes what the perverts call a furry. But I am still impressed by that every time I see it. And yes, there is another American werewolf movie that did the transformation better, but since that one takes place in London, I don't think I really need to bring that one up in this review. As for the other actors, everyone is amazing in this film. Everyone gives it their all. Evelyn Ankers as the love interest does an amazing job. Claude Rains is spectacular and heartbreaking as Larry's father. And Bela Lugosi, well, he's Bela Lugosi, a true legend. I don't think I need to go further than that, to be honest. But to wrap up this review, I will say that everyone, please, 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 do not forget the classics. Always support them. If you haven't seen this one, give it a try. If you have, watch it again. Buy it, rent it, whatever you have to do, make sure that you keep these movies alive. I can't tell you what it is, and maybe I sound a little alarmist, but I really feel like one day these movies won't even be taught in film schools anymore, and instead we will be shown Tarantino films and told that those are how a great movie should be.
So yeah, that was my review on The Wolfman, and bye.